I'm hitting record. Okay. So last week we ended off with a discussion, and if you have the Tanya book, good. If not, obviously I'll share when we're discussing actual text. But last week we ended off with the discussion. You know, we've had, so to speak, we had all the chapters discussing the godly soul. Then we started discussing the animal soul, which the animal soul is a mirror image of the godly soul. And then we said that any thought, deed, action, speech, anything that is not godly is automatically ungodly. Okay, so I'll repeat that again. Anything that's not godly is automatically ungodly. So people who are wondering, so what does that mean? If I go to the gym, is that ungodly? If I go to work, is that ungodly? If I eat lunch, is that ungodly? And the answer is not necessarily. If you're going to the gym to be stronger, to be able to serve God, and to be healthy, to do God's will, that's okay. If you're going to work to make money, to support your family, and to fulfill your God-given mission, and to give charity, then it's all okay. If you're going swimming, all these things can be godly. Now, one thing we had a discussion last week was, what if there's a mixture, you know? And although we say that either an action is godly or ungodly, all that means is that the drive to do something is either godly or ungodly, okay? In other words, if it's not godly, it's ungodly. However, you can be doing a single item for two reasons. In other words, I can be going to the gym both for a godly and ungodly reason. I can be driven by two desires. In fact, that is something that happened after the sin of Adam and Eve. It says that when before Adam and Eve, before they ate from the tree of knowledge, it said good and evil existed outside of them, wasn't enmeshed with them. That's why they could be naked. They didn't notice anything. They were able, in other words, why do we need to wear clothing, really? What's the problem? It's just body parts, but we're in an enmeshed world where we cannot just see the holiness of the body, okay? We're enmeshed right now where there's the holiness of the body, but there's also the desire, the physical desires, and those things, it's all enmeshed. And so we need to clothe ourselves in many different areas. We have enmeshment in everything that we have of good and not necessarily good. That's what was created by them eating of the tree of knowledge. That's what it means, the tree of knowledge. Did they not know what the Kabbalists explained? And I think I explained it. I've given a class on this before, but it's a while. The Kabbalists explained, what do you mean? Before they sinned, they didn't know about bad? They knew about bad. But the difference is when they ingested the tree of knowledge, the knowledge of evil was mixed within them. It wasn't just the knowledge about something that's out there. Like angels also know about evil, but evil is not a part of their psyche. They know that evil exists. They know what is evil, but it doesn't exist and enmeshed within themselves. By us, ungodliness, and that's what we're going to call it, and we'll explain a little bit more, is enmeshed within us. Therefore, it's very possible that we can buy a shirt, we can go to work, we can go to the gym, we can eat food, all for two reasons at the same time, for a godly and ungodly reason. But we have to appreciate and understand that our goal is obviously to become more godly, and it's anything that's not godly is ungodly. In other words, if I'm going to the gym just to be strong so that I impress other people, or I want to look good, or whatever it is, that is ungodly, okay? Now, you may also be going to the gym with the purpose of being healthy to serve God. That may be somewhat of a factor in your decision to go. But remember, the desire to go to look strong and mighty and be impressive, that is definitely an ungodly desire, okay? So even though you might say, well, I'm not sinning, but as we discussed last week, if it's not godly, it's ungodly. There's only two sides to the coin. There's only two options. Something's either godly or ungodly, okay? Now people wanted to know, if I'm going to work, how do I know if I'm doing it for the right reasons? You know, when I'm involved in work, and of course we discussed, if you start with your morning prayer, meditation, and you orient yourself in the right mindset, then when you go to work, you start with the right mindset. I'm going to work to serve God. What does serving God mean? It means to have a living, have a family within which I create a place for God, a home for God, and I will do mitzvahs with this money that I get, and do charity and change the world around me. If you go with the right mindset, that helps you do your daily business with the right ideas and thoughts. Okay, so today So that was mostly discussing our godly soul itself. This week, we're going to get a little bit more into the world itself. In other words, we were discussing our actions and our deeds and our thoughts. Now this week we're going to expand the discussion to discussing things in this world. Are they good, aka godly, or are they not good, aka ungodly? So, and it's going to tie into last week's discussion as well, and I'll give more context to it. And it's going to require a lengthy preface, which is what I'm going to jump into now. So, I'm going to dive into a thought here with you. We're gonna explore this together, and you'll let me know how you feel about it and what you think about it. Let's present it like this. Anybody here ever been to a wedding? Yeah, I assume so, right? Been to a wedding. Now, I've been to many weddings. Now, some weddings you go to and you know the bride and groom very well, and you dance with them and you have a lot of fun with them. Some weddings you go to and for whatever reason, you don't know the bride and groom at all, know much about them. You had to go for other reasons. You had to show up. And so you go to the wedding and you end up just talking with your friends, eating a bunch of food, and you don't end up ever, dancing with and enlivening the wedding itself. In other words, you play zero role. During the chuppah, you're standing in the back talking to your friend. During the wedding itself, you're sitting off to the corner talking to your friends and eating some good food, and then you leave. You don't even leave a present. Okay. In this scenario, in essence, you've totally missed out, so to speak. You've missed the boat. The whole purpose of the food, the whole purpose of the music. Oh, let's say you even were sitting in the back enjoying the music. The whole purpose of the food, the whole purpose of the music, the whole purpose of the hall was all to celebrate the bride and groom, and you were not involved in that at all. And so there was, so to speak, this big show going on, and you got all of the outer essence of it, but you didn't actually accomplish what was supposed to be done. You weren't a part of the real show. So, did you technically go to the wedding? Yes, you went to the wedding. Did you technically enjoy the wedding? You enjoyed the wedding, but you were not really a part of the wedding. In other words, in life, there is the means to the end and there is the end. So you, so to speak, spent a lot of time in the means to the end without getting to the end. The same thing as we're going to discuss today is this entire world. This entire world and everything that's within it, all the boats and all the airplanes and all the food and all the clothing and all the gyms and all the flat screen TVs and all the iPhones, this is all here for a wedding, the wedding of us and God, our relationship with God and what we accomplish here within this world. And it's a means to an end. And very often we get caught up in the means and forget about the end. And when we do that, ultimately, we're creating a disconnect and we're completely losing what we're trying to do. And so that's what we're going to discuss today. How do we know what is the means? What's the end? How do we define, and what will we call something that is the mean without the end? So let's start with the word holiness. I keep saying the word godly. Let's start with the word holiness. What is holy? What is Kedusha? Kedusha means holiness in Hebrew. What is holiness? What makes something holy? Any thoughts?
Special.
Special?
Separate.
Separate, okay.
Just being closer to God.
Closer to God, okay. Any other thoughts?
Like,
Huh? No other thoughts? All right, so yes, holiness can be translated as spiritual, can be translated as the will of God. It can be translated as separate. Separate, for example, it says when you get married, you say Hare at mekudeshet li, you are betrothed to me. The word mekudeshet in Hebrew means separate. The commentaries actually explain it means that you are married and you're separated from the rest of the world. So kadosh, holiness, in a sense, does mean separate. And there is only one thing that is really separate from everything else. And that is God. God is completely separate, so to speak. He is above and beyond everything that we see. And, you know, when you think of someone who's holy, right? When you think of somebody holy, you do think of someone who's separated from the rest of the world, someone who is on their own level, right? That's how we tend to think of really holy people. They are separated people. You don't think of the guy who sits in the restaurant and eats lots of, he stuffs his face and then goes out jet skiing as holy, right? That's not typically how we translate. Or when we do something holy, we're separating, right? We're separating. When we do something holy, Shabbat, we're separating from the world. When I pray, I'm separating myself from the world. Even if I eat in a holy manner, we would expect a more refined way of eating. So kadosh, kedusha, holiness is typically experienced by a degree of separateness, okay? So how do we become holy? How do we become holy? How do we connect with God? And that is, of course, by separating ourselves from the world and really connecting with God. And I would say by putting aside our own desires, putting aside our own feelings, putting aside our own will. The Talmud says that anybody who has an ego, God says, me and him, we cannot remain in the same place. Okay? In order for God to enter our lives and to give us this holiness, this separateness, we need to put aside our ego. Ego is, as we've said so many times in the Tanya, is what is the root of all evil within our lives and the root of all evil within the world around us. There was a what was it? There was a what do you saw? This guy that sank this boat in the sea, right? This Titan or whatever it was. A lot of what he did was based on his ego. He didn't, he felt he had all the answers. He didn't want to listen to other people. It's interesting. I guess ego in a way also separates you from others. But ego in a sense is you're separating yourself from others, but not in a way that you allow others into your life. Unlike holiness, which allows others into your life. Anyways, that's just a side point. So anyways, so how about Moses? What is one of the few descriptions the Torah gives about Moses? How does the Torah describe Moses? His character. What does it say about him? Anybody knows?
Humble.
What?
Humble.
Very good. Yep. Humble. Exactly. Moshe was humble. That was a necessary ingredient to be Moshe, the holiest of all men. To be able to receive the Torah, in order to give it over to others, you need to be humble. That's what Kedusha is. You need to be able to have humility. And angels, so within this world, so let's think of holy things. We think of things in heaven as holy. Angels are holy. Why are angels holy? Because they don't have an ego. They don't have a self-desire. Their desire is only what God wants of them, right? That's what makes an angel holy. So what would make us holy would make us putting aside our desire and doing what God wants. That's why a mitzvah is, in a sense, making us holy, because a mitzvah is doing God's will, not your own will. right? That's what a mitzvah is about. It's putting aside your will and doing what God asks of you. So if we want to be holy, what is the way to become holy? The way to become holy is by putting aside our will. So anything that is not allowing God in is automatically not holy. Okay? Does that make sense? Any thoughts or comments on holiness? Holiness is a topic we can discuss for hours, days on end. Anybody has any thoughts on holiness? Don't all shout out at once. I'm just pulling up the text of error for the screen. No? Okay. All right. Let's take a look over here at the text. Let's see what it says. All right, so we're on page 86. Okay, this is on page 86. He says, I think we read this, but I'll read this again. This applies not only to actions, but also any ostensibly neutral spoken word or thought, which, while not religiously forbidden, are not constantly directed towards God to fill his will or his worship. These two are powered by the animal soul and serve to strengthen negative egoic forces. I think I read that last week. And again, that goes on the theme that anything that's not godly is ungodly. With this in mind, we can appreciate why the negative forces of the universe are referred to by the Kabbalah as Sitra Achra. This is the meaning of the Sitra Achra, which translates as the other side, anything which is not the holy side. The other side includes all religiously forbidden activities and any ordinary acts not directed towards God's will or worship. What then is the definition of holy side? So again, anything that's not towards God is not holy. So what is holy? And the holy side includes only something into which God's holiness can be drawn and be present. And God's presence will only rest on a thing which has surrendered, batel, its ego to him. That's a good word, surrendered. So if you surrender yourself towards God, you are allowing God into your life. And that's a sign of humility. That's why holy people, real holy people, we appreciate very much. We connect with them because real holy people, we don't see an ego in them. They're allowing, but what makes them holy is allowing God into their lives. That's also why someone who may be, let's say, very wise and may do a lot of good deeds, we may not consider them holy. If we don't see within them an absence of self, if we don't see any surrender within their life, we will not consider them holy. So you can have a great rabbi who gives great sermons and great jokes, maybe even great jokes. So you can have a great rabbi, gives great sermons, great jokes, and really does all the right things, but you can tell he's full of himself, okay? If you know this guy personally, you would not call him holy, right? You would say, oh, that rabbi, yeah, I know him. Yeah, he gives a good speech, but he's not so holy. I like his jokes, I like his speech, I like his thoughts, but he's not so holy, right? So we can see here, holiness is not defined necessarily by actions. Now, although any action of surrender is an act of surrender, even if you don't feel the surrender, right? I'll say that again. An action of surrender is surrender, even if you don't feel the surrender, which is why you will, to an extent, allow God in your life. So just in our case, if I do a mitzvah, but I'm full of myself, God will come into my life to an extent, although it will be limited because my feelings have not allowed God in enough. But the action of surrender, of doing God's mitzvah, doing God's commandment, will allow God into my life. Tanya will talk about this in the end of it, in the chapters 40 and on, where it discusses the importance of kavanah in a mitzvah, where it discusses the importance of intention and how intention, having the proper intention when you do a mitzvah, will allow more of God's light to come into your life and exactly what that looks like. But you get the idea. Surrender is what allows God in. When you surrender your ego, a mitzvah, by definition, is surrender to God. However, you can have feelings which are a lack of surrender at that moment as well. And therefore, you will not allow God into life as much as if you do surrender yourself more. And this is also why, as I said, you can have somebody who does all the right things and acts really holy and, is a great rabbi, but is not very surrendered towards God, and they're not very holy. Let's read this. In a Tanya's worldview, an experience of Bittul, of surrendering the ego to God, is a fundamental prerequisite of real living. It represents a departure from a personal consciousness that attributes separate existence to the self, to gradually embrace a transpersonal vision that sees all existence as embedded in the universe, saturated with the divine. Any shift of the animal soul in this direction, whether it be a mere willingness to listen to a higher truth, a purely cerebral appreciation of God's presence, or a total realignment of being, could be termed as Bittul, surrender. Once Bittul, surrender, has begun, the ego is punctured and the divine light can start to seep through the cracks, intensifying the experience of Bittul, which can occur at many different levels, requiring a lifetime of spiritual work. So I want to delve into this a little bit more because it's such an important and fundamental topic to Hasidic thought, and really is what changed how Hasidic thought changed the way we treated Judaism. Until Hasidic thought, and this started with the Baal Shem Tov, the thought was that the important thing is study Torah, do mitzvahs, and this whole idea of surrender was not really there. That's why you had, in those days, many great and wise scholars who looked down at the simple folk. Because in their mind, Judaism was about studying the Torah, doing the mitzvahs, and they looked at the simple folk who could barely study Torah or do a proper mitzvah, they looked down at them. And the Baal Shem Tov changed around. It's not about that. It's about your degree of surrender. Yes, everybody should do the mitzvahs to the utmost that they can. Everybody should study to the utmost that they can at their level. But what separates one person from another is not the degree of how much they've studied. What separates them is the degree of their surrender. Yes, if you have someone who's not studying as much as they could at their level, then obviously they're not surrendering, right? But just because someone can barely study the Aleph base, but if they're working hard at that, that doesn't make them any worse than the great Torah scholar who could study pages and pages of Talmud. But if they're not working the hardest, if they're not working on their surrender, they're not letting God into their life as much as that simple person. This is what Hasidic philosophy brought to the world, is changing the focus. It's not just about the actions, it's also about the inner work. And this is also why I've said many times, remember, we've been going back and forth about this idea, what's important? Is it important to do the right thing, or is it important to feel the right thing? Well, now we're starting to get an inkling of the answer. To an extent, yes, the most important thing is to get the deed done. But if you want God's divine presence to rest on you, if you want to allow God into your life and the world around you, you need to have more surrender in your life. And more surrender in your life comes the more you work on yourself. If you're always focused on just getting the deed done, just doing the right thing, never working on yourself, never meditating, never praying, never contemplating about God, your degree of surrender will be very little. And this is why you'll find many people who are, again, they have a lot of study, but if they're not working on themselves, the degree of surrender within their life and humility is lacking. And according to the Tanya, if you're lacking in the humility, even if you are a great scholar and do all the right things, the degree of God's ability to rest upon you is limited because your ego pushes out God. Our ego pushes out God, and therefore you're missing in the holiness. Just to share a story here that I have in this book. The story, this is from, it's a story of the Baal Shem Tov. So the story was, there was once in the times of the Baal Shem Tov, it was very common people would live ascetic lifestyle. In other words, they would sit in a room separate from the world, and they would study Torah all day, and they would get a little bit of food. Okay. Now, and there was one town, there was a great rabbi who was a hermit like this, and he used to study, and he would fast from Shabbos to Shabbos. He would only eat every Shabbos. So, he would study all day. He would barely sleep. He would eat he'd eat one day a week. I'm sure he would drink during the rest of the week. And the custom of this great rabbi was that every Erev Shabbat, every week on Friday afternoon, he would sit on a stone at the gate of the mikvah, the men's mikvah, and as the people would come into the mikvah, all the men would wish him a very good Shabbos. You should be healthy. Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Live long years. And they told the Baal Shem Tov about this great hermit, telling him, wow, look at this great, rabbi. He sits all day and he studies and he fasts. Holy of holy. He's separate from the world. He's holy. And the Baal Shem Tov said, I want you to take away the rock that this guy sits on in front of the mikvah. So that way this week, he won't be able to sit in front of the mikvah. So he removed the rock, and that week, that hermit died. The ascetic died. So they came to the Baal Shem Tov and says, well, you know, what witchcraft is going on? What are you doing? You know, why did the guy suddenly die? You remove a stone, he dies. He says, listen, let me tell you, this hermit, he was not serving God out of holiness. He was serving God out of ego. And therefore, his entire life force was coming from the unclean side. His life force, his living was coming from not holiness, but from the unholy side. What was unholy about his life? He lived his whole life just so people could respect him. Just so every Friday people could come to him and look up to him. And therefore, says the Alter Rabbi, when I removed that stone, when he did not anymore get the ego, his life force was cut off and he died. It's an interesting story, but it brings out the point. The point is, you can live an entire, quote unquote, holy lifestyle. If you don't do the inner work and there's no surrender towards God, God is not shining in your life. Now, I want to point out what Rabbi Miller did here in the Tanya. This commentary really wrote it beautifully about surrender, really depicting to us that surrender is a lifetime of work. Look what he writes here. Let me go back actually to the previous page because it was really important. 2 paragraphs that he said over here. Sorry, let me just flip this to this side. Okay, so he said over here. I just want to read this because this is so important. Because if you think that this is beyond your league, so to speak, to get to the surrender of God, read what he says here again. I'm going to read it again from the bottom of page 86. In the Tanya's worldview, an experience of Bittul, surrendering the ego to God, is a fundamental prerequisite to real living. It represents the departure from a personal consciousness that attributes separate existence to the self. Listen to that. Personal consciousness that attributes separate existence to the self. In other words, the ego basically feels itself. And it's very conscious of itself. To gradually, that's an important word, gradually embrace a transpersonal vision that sees all existence as embedded in the universe saturated with the divine. So our goal in life is to see everything as being saturated in the divine, being transpersonal. We want to see ourselves as being a part of God, not about there's me and I connect to God. And look at how great I am that I connect to God. No, it's not that I connect to God. I want to come to a place where I, so to speak, I'm subsumed within God. I am just a part of God. I'm not just connecting to him who's far away. What does it mean to connect to God? Really means to become part of God. That's really what a mitzvah does to you, if you appreciate it. Any shift of the animal soul in this direction, this is, again, I'm saying it's important because he's talking about gradual, whether it be a mere willingness to listen to higher truth, that'll be beginning, a purely cerebral appreciation of God's presence, or a total realignment of being in which you perceive yourself as part of God, could be termed as Bittul surrender. Once Bittul surrender has begun, the ego is punctured and divine light can start to seep through the cracks. Intensifying the experience of Bittul surrender, which can occur at many different levels, requires a lifetime of spiritual work. So this is not easy, people. The Tanya is the guidebook to our life. But it's not like, it's like the bad self-help books that you always got to read, The Tanya is not a self-help book that you read once and I don't mean it's a bad book, but I mean, it's not, it doesn't give you, it actually is not, it's not like you read it and now your life is all better. No, it aligns you what you should be doing in your day-to-day life, but now you got to do the work. And that's what's going on over here. The Tanya is telling us how hard our life is. It's not hard. It's good. Don't worry. It's good. But we have to come to a point where we are always in alignment, not only as we're saying today, not only connecting with God, but ultimately we want to be subsumed with God. We want to feel God in everything that we do. Just for example, in Jewish law, there's a discussion about washing the hands. Now, you all know that when we wash for bread, we wash 3 times on the right, 3 times on the left, right? 3 times right, 3 times left. In Jewish law, it's actually not so clear why you would do 3 times. 3 times is a big question. Many Jews do it only twice. Where does the 3 times come from? So it's a very iffy source. I'm not going to get into it now, but the story is like this. The 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe was one time seen washing his hands 3 times on the right, 3 times on the left. And they asked him, why are you doing that? And he said, off the top of my, I think this is what I recall. He said, off the top of my head, I don't know. But he said, I know that I've trained myself to always act in accordance with God's will. And therefore, if I'm doing it, it must be God's will. Now, later on, he gave a source. But the point is that a tzaddik at such a high caliber is so aligned with God that they're always doing what God wants, whether they even have to, in other words, we always, when we want to do something right, we have to consciously think about it, right? When you get to a very high spiritual state, you are so surrendered to God that you automatically are doing the right thing. It's like it says Abraham. It says Abraham was a Merkava. Abraham was a chariot of God. What is a chariot? Chariot means that a chariot has no will. God leads the chariot where it goes. A tzaddik is ultimately at such a high level where they have no yetzer hara and they're completely subsumed and aligned with God's will. They're a complete reflection of godliness within their life. We are not at that level yet. We can, of course, be inspired from these great tzaddikim, but we have a lifetime of work to reach there. And as the Tanya will discuss, we'll probably never reach to the end. And the goal is not necessarily to get to the end. The goal is to work your hardest every single day, as the Tanya will discuss somewhere else. That's our goal. Our goal is to constantly struggle. That's what God wants of us. God enjoys the struggle, as we'll discuss other places in Tanya. Honestly, our lives are in general a struggle, and sometimes we wonder why. The answer is that's part of the enjoyment and part of what God desires. The overcoming the obstacles. Tzaddikim, it's a big question. What do tzaddikim do? If tzaddikim don't struggle, if righteous people don't struggle, so what? But I hope it was recording before. It's been on for a while, right? Sure hope so. However, we want to make sure that we are gradually working on our spirituality, and most importantly, as we've discussed today, our surrender. Now, based on this idea, okay, we've explored surrender as it applies within our lives and what our job in life is to allow more surrender to God within our life. And when I say surrender, it means viewing the world not from a ego place, which means I'm what matters, but from a place of the whole world is subsumed within God. And I have to come to that recognition. And that's why, by the way, when you go to the gym, this goes back, by the way, to my wedding analogy. If you're going to the gym and you're just focusing on being strong and looking good, it's like going to the wedding and just eating the food and enjoying the music and sitting in the back and talking, okay? Or I was actually going to give another example of shul. Some people come to shul. They sit in the back and they talk, and then they eat the kiddush food, and then they leave, right? When really, why are they coming? You should come at least somewhat to pray. You should come to elevate yourself spiritually as well. The food and the social aspect is only there to feed the spiritual aspect. But often we can get lost in the physical aspect. You can do this at any holiday event as well, right? So you can come to the whole Purim party and miss the Megillah reading. Well, actually, that's not a good example, because having a feast on Purim itself is a mitzvah. So I shouldn't say that necessarily. But you get the idea. You get the idea. So if we go to the gym and we're not doing any point of surrender to God, then we're missing out on the main point. We're stuck in externalities, and we're missing out on the main point. So this concept of surrender that applies within our lives applies also within the world around us. That's what defines what is holy and what's not holy. It depends on its degree of surrender towards God. Some things are naturally surrendered towards God, like angels. Some things have a potential to be surrendered to God, and some things can never be properly surrendered to God. That's what we're going to discuss now, and that's what defines something as permitted or forbidden. defines something as being allowed or not allowed based on its degree and possibility for surrender towards God. Now, you may ask if something, what's its purpose? We'll discuss that as well. But let's take a look. I first want to discuss angels and people, their surrender towards God, and then we'll get to everything else in this world. Okay, oops, it's the wrong page. So we spoke about a moment ago that surrender can apply at many different levels. Just got to move these videos out of the way. Okay, so it's driving me a little crazy. Put it over here. Let's see if it does it right. I don't know. Zoom is being funny right now. Oh, there. Okay. So now he's going to talk about surrender. Bittul opens an individual to God, regardless of whether it is an active, conscious bittul, as is always the case with regard to spiritual angels who are constantly enraptured by God's presence, or even if the bittul of surrender lies dormant. The lowest level of bittul of surrender is subconscious. Merely possessing a divine soul means that you have a potential for bittul, for surrender dormant in your being. This is always true of every person in Israel down here in this world, who by virtue of his or her divine soul has the potential for complete surrender to God by giving his or her life in martyrdom towards God. So what are we talking about here? This sounds really strange because either you're surrendered towards God or you're not surrendered towards God. So the answer is that we tend to think of potential as in, well, everybody has a potential, right? Everybody can become a doctor. Everybody can make millions if they worked really hard. That's not the potential that we're talking about over here. I would put it like a seed. A seed, what's a potential that can always work? Anybody? I'm trying to think of an example. What's a potential that if you just activate it? Well, okay, you know what? My refrigerator. Okay, my refrigerator always has the potential. If I go and tap it, water will come out, right? Okay, now people have a potential to make millions, but that takes a lot of time and a lot of work. It's not, I wouldn't call it's a very, very dormant ability, okay? If even, okay? But the refrigerator always has the potential to give me water, let's say. So the same thing it says is a godly soul. Is a godly soul that we have is inherently surrendered towards God. That is why the moment the shell is taken away, surrender reveals itself. That's why in a moment, Jews who never believed in God or religion or anything else, in the moment of martyrdom, we've seen many Jews have given up their lives for God's name, right? Why is that? Because what we're saying is that inherently your godly soul is always surrendered towards God. The only thing is it's covered. You know, you just haven't pressed the button. It's always there. That's why I could stop a guy in the street, ask him, do you want to put on tefillin? He'll say no. I say, please. He says, okay, I'll do you a favor. He puts on tefillin and he starts crying. Why? What happened, right? Well, what suddenly happened? What changed? Well, his godly soul was always surrendered towards God. But, you know, something happened and it became revealed. So what we're trying to say over here is that this surrender that you have within your godly soul, that alone, because that surrender always exists, it's just, you know, just covered up right now. Therefore, automatically, you are to an extent always a vessel for godliness. Let's turn the page because that lesson is as the Tanya will later elaborate, page 88. the phenomenon of martyrdom by so many Jews throughout history, many of which were not religiously observant, suggests a latent power within the Jewish psyche to disregard all self-interest for God's sake. To the Tanya, this is evidence of a divine presence in our souls. Here the Tanya draws on this idea to prove that there's an ever-present source of Bittul surrender within us. Even if you have not achieved the most basic level of conscious Bittul surrender, in a subconscious layer of your soul, Bittul surrender is present. This dormant Bittul surrender is sufficient to enable God's presence to enter. That's why our sages have said, even when a single person sits and studies Torah, the divine presence rests on him, regardless of the person's spiritual standing, because every Jew has a dormant Bittul surrender, which is conducive to the divine presence. That's why, by the way, going back to what we said earlier, even if someone is doing a mitzvah with complete ego, that also allows the God to rest on them to an extent because of the dormant surrender. Obviously, if you actually surrender, you'll have God shine in your soul even more. And furthermore, on any group of 10, the divine presence rests, always, even when they're not studying Torah, performing a mitzvah. So here's the crazy thing. When you have a minyan together, it says the divine presence rests there. So if you have a minyan, even without praying, just a minyan alone causes the divine presence to rest. That's why it's very important, by the way, when you have a minyan, to make sure you do holy things. Because imagine you have 10 people there and you have the minyan and God's divine presence is there and you're chit-chatting. You're not respecting God's divine presence that is there. So all this is to prove he was bringing text, as I said many times. The Tanya is also written for a scholar. So if you don't connect with this point, that's not so important. But he's proving from text that this concept, that the potential of surrender within us allows God's divine presence to rest upon us, and he's bringing proof from these two sources. Okay, I want to pause for a moment and just read the comments here. Someone here quoted from Pirkei Avot, which says, make his will your will so that he can make your will his will. Pirkei Avot, very good. Surrender. And the second one is, surrendering is not so easy. We tend to hold on tightly to the things that satisfy our physical desires. Surrender is not easy, correct. And it's a lifetime of work, as we mentioned. All right, so all now what we've spoken about till now is surrendered items. You know, we spoke about angels and godly souls. Those are surrendered items. Okay. I want to look at, oh, yeah. Honesty, right? Honesty. There was, where was that? It's gonna, all right, it's not so important right now. Okay. It's 12:48. And the next section is really, will require a lot more time where we discuss I'm going to read the beginning of it, but we're not going to go further because we're going to need to discuss it more. I'll leave you with the question. All right, so if something doesn't have surrender, that would tell us that God is not resting on them, which will create a problem, as he says. An entity which lacks Bittul cannot be a vessel for God's holiness. As he says, anything, however, which is not surrendered itself to its ego to God and perceives itself as a separate entity to exist, will not receive its life energy from God's holiness. This leaves us with the question, where does such an entity derive its spiritual energy and life force from, if not from God? Doesn't the monotheistic belief of Judaism teach that everything exists by virtue of God's sustenance alone? So that's the question for next week, which we're going to discuss. How exactly this works. If something is not surrendered, no. Where is its life force? Do we have a belief that some other religions have, that things that are ungodly or Satan have their own power? Obviously, we don't believe that. So how exactly does this all work? And that is going to be for next week. What I want you to walk away with is two important definitions today. Number one, actually three important definitions. Number one is holy. What makes something holy? Holy is God, who's separate from this world. If we want to connect with God, Kedusha, holiness, the real holiness, which is God, the only thing that's really separate from this world, we need to place ourselves in a level of Bittul, surrender. Only with surrender can we allow God into our lives. Why? Because God is the only real existence of this world, and our ego does not allow that truth to be seen. Okay, so again, ego covers over the truth. God is holy, and God is really the truth of this world. And anything that is not surrendered towards God is basically ego, is basically hiding the truth of God. You can't have ego and have God, because ego is the antithesis of the reality of God. Because the reality of God is that God is the only real thing, right? Not your stupid gym and your six pack and your muscles and your iPhone and your flat screen TV, right? Those are all just a part of God's big wedding. Okay, those are all just a big part of God's reality and why everything's here. But your ego, your focus on your flat screen TV and your fancy car and your fancy house, your fancy whatever you have in your life, and your fancy sunglasses, whatever it is in your life, separates you from the truth that the reality is all God. Again, if it's going back to the wedding analogy, it's like you're separating yourself from the real wedding that's going on. So we had holiness, which is God. We had Bittul, we had surrender. And the last line we have is Sitra Achra. This is a line you'll hear a lot in the Kabbalah. Have a great day. Glad you're able to stay a little bit longer than usual. The Sitra Achra. The Sitra Achra is a line we just said on page 86. It's important to remember this word because it's quoted a lot in the Tanya. Sitra Achra means the other side. Okay, it was over here. This is the meaning of Sitra Achra. Sitra Achra is Aramaic. It means the other side. Anything that's not holy is automatically the other side. Remember, as we defined, if something's not holy, it's automatically unholy. Which is why unholy things are called Sitra Achra. They're the other side. In other words, either you're on the right side or you're on the wrong side. That's why that's the word that's used. We don't say there's holy, there's middle, there's unholy. We'll get into a middle ground later where a middle ground does exist, but we'll have to put it in context. But in essence, if something is not on God's side, it's Sitra Achra, it's the other side. Okay, so remember that word, Sitra Achra, anything that is not the holy side. And as he said, the other side includes all religiously forbidden activity and any ordinary acts not directed towards God's will or worship. So those are the three translations I want you to walk away with: Kedusha, holiness; Bittul, surrender; Sitra Achra, the other side. And the lesson I want you to walk away with today is the concept that we just discussed, is why it's so important not just do the right thing. Because what God wants is to be able to shine his light within ourselves and within our world. And it's a lifetime of work. And that's why it's important not only to put on the tefillin and to say the prayers and to eat matzah. And as I mentioned earlier, if you don't do those things, it makes it harder for you to connect with God 100%. But it's important not only to do all the mitzvahs, but to work on ourselves. And this is something that Hasidic philosophy brought to the world, that the Baal Shem Tov brought to the world. And it's actually an empowering idea, because what it tells us is that it's not the how successful I am. In other words, what defines a greater or less greater person, and it's not about being great really, but what defines greater or less great is not to the extent of Torah knowledge that they have, or the extent of how deep they can do the mitzvahs, but the level of surrender that you can bring into your life. Of course, the more surrender you bring, the more you'll do. But some of us are going to be inherently limited. Not everybody is going to be the greatest Torah scholar. Not everybody can do mitzvahs to the great extent that some of the most righteous people can do. But if we want to bring God's light into this world and in our lives, the most important element is surrender. And if that is true, that's the Baal Shem Tov's view of the world. And of course, I believe it's true. But if that is true, we have to spend time working in our surrender, not just working and doing the right thing, but also working in our surrender. Because if we don't, it will not come. Because studying Torah and doing mitzvahs can also feed our ego. They can also very much feed our ego. Of course, if you don't like them, it won't feed your ego. But let's say, especially like me, if you live in the religious world, they can be very much egocentric, study and prayer and all that stuff. It can very much feed your ego. And so you have to be very careful to always be working on yourselves. And even in the synagogue, sometimes you want to impress other people. So a lot of it is about our surrender towards God and Bittul, as we have called it. I'm going to end the recording, and I'm going to open it up to questions. And I wish you all good luck on your surrender. It's going to be lifelong work, and we're going to work in it more as we go through the Tanya. Of course, we'll give you some tools to help you do that.